Sugo. Welcome everyone to chapter 13 of Mad Bear, The Longest Walk. We may still have a chance to feel safe and easy again. In early autumn, I returned to Topeka. Rolling Thunder's daughter and son-in-law had come to live with me for a time, and together we rented a house in Topeka. I had thought I would leave soon after they did, perhaps move back west also and rejoin them. But then I went on the road with Joel for nearly a month, leaving an empty house behind. An acquaintance at the Manager Foundation suggested I might tuck in some Washburn student to share the runt since my place was near the university. Students are always looking for living situations like this, he claimed, and it's a chance for you to meet some more like-minded people who are interested in the work. I agreed to let him post some notices around his alma mater just to see what might happen. That's how I met John Cates and began a long-time working association. John came to the door with a copy of Rolling Thunder in his hand. "This is why I called you," he said. "I'm not really looking for a place. When I saw your notice, it just seemed like the kind of thing one ought to follow up on." John was an employee at the university library, I learned, and he had ample time for reading as he sat behind the desk. He was right in the middle of Rolling Thunder when he saw my name on the bulletin board. "I almost never look at that board," he told me. "There are only ads and notices for students that don't concern me, but yesterday I was on my way down the hall on my coffee break, and I happened to glance up and see your name. I don't know why it caught my eye, I just happened to look up. And then I looked at your book. I had my fingers inside the pages just like this to keep my place." This was just a little too much, so I thought, I'm going to find out if this is the same guy. "Now I see why you asked me about the book," I said, remembering that this was his first question when he called me on the phone. "I never saw those ads, and I didn't know what they said. A friend of mine put them up. I didn't know he was going to include mention of the book." "No, he didn't. The one I saw said something like, 'Wanted, student to share house near campus, preferably someone interested in other cultures.' And it had your name and number. Of course, I'm not a student and I don't need a place, but then I guess I really wouldn't mind moving out of where I am. I mean, I'm open. I'm certainly interested in other cultures. The only thing, I have a lot of plants." So over the next few days, during several lunches and dinners and coffees, we explored why John had noticed the ad and why he had responded to it. In a little more than a month after we had met, John and I moved into a still larger house even closer to the campus and opened the first office and drop-in center of the Cross-Cultural Studies program. It was on College Avenue, just a few blocks down the street from Washburn University. We began to hold open house gatherings, and within only a few weeks, we had met dozens of new friends and neighbors who come around to share discussion and refreshments. Through the winter, we continued our weekly meeting. We called them Winter Wraps, and in the spring, we began to hold project meetings and Sunday night pujas for chanting, meditation, or simply silence. Interestingly, many busy people dropped in for the Sunday night sessions. "There aren't many places one can go just for silence," people told us. One day, Mad Bear telephoned to relay some of his own impressions about our space and our gatherings. He had not yet had a chance to visit our College Avenue Center, or even to come to Topeka. "I thought I'd drop in and pay a visit," he told me on the phone. "So I went ahead and took my dream medicine. I thought I might catch a sight of you. There were people in that room there where you hold the meetings, but you weren't in there. I figured if you were, you might sort of pick up that I was looking in on you. I didn't want to snoop, so I figured I'd come around on one of those open nights, and I saw so many shoes. I knew a bunch of people were there. At first I didn't know where the people were, so I checked the dining room and the kitchen, but then I went ahead and went upstairs. Then I felt like I had my shoes off, 'cause I could feel that thick red carpet on my feet. When I do actually come out there, I hope you've got a chair or something at the bottom of those stairs, 'cause I can't take my shoes off standing up, or get them back on again. Anyways, I was just looking at everybody who was sitting there, but, like I said, you weren't in there." And then I got a little glimpse of the future there. Well, I just caught sight of a future possibility. But I don't think you'd have to worry about it. I'll tell you, but you have to take it as symbolic. That's the way those foresights are. The image that he related was so bizarre, it was obvious and fortunate as well that it was only symbolic. There was a significant connotation behind it, however, and I discussed it with John. We agreed that, somehow or the other, Madbear had indeed paid a visit. He had described our place quite accurately. The puja room was indeed upstairs. I had never told him that. We had been there only a short while, and there had been a little chance during that brief time to speak with Madbear. He had seen where the shoes were, and even seen and felt that red-carpeted stairway. Even his prophetic glimpse made sense in its symbolic way. We knew who and what he was referring to. The people he described were both overdressed and underdressed, as he had put it, trying to look both sexy and glamorous, and they were trying to glamorize the puja room. They had this thick black velvet draped all over the place, he said, and they were sprinkling this stuff on it, like they were trying to hurry so if you disapproved it'd be too late. What do you call those little shiny things like some women put in their hair? Little spangles or what? Anyways, they're real artificial looking. Well, it made quite a flashy spectacle, but really pretentious. You know, it's not all genuine. Not toward the purpose you're supposed to be set up with. It's pretty accurate, John acknowledged. Symbolic, yeah, but accurate. We should take it as a kind of confirmation of what we've been talking about, and keep on emphasizing the work in the projects and de-emphasize all the far-out stuff. New Age goodies or whatever. In the spring, John noticed a bulletin posted around the college buildings and grounds announcing the appearance on campus of representatives of AIM. AIM, the American Indian Movement, along with traditional spiritual leaders from many tribes, had begun a cross-country march in response to newly proposed legislation intended to abrogate existing treaties and terminate the remaining Indian reservations. They called it the longest walk. The speakers who were scheduled to appear were part of several advance teams who were traveling ahead to generate publicity and support for their cause. John and I walked up to the campus to attend the gathering and listen to the speakers. Vincent Bellicourt and Bill Wapapa, well-known AIM leaders, were there, among others, and both of them spoke. Though there had been considerable publicity, only a handful of students and a few people from the local Indian community showed up. Still, the speakers gave energetic and impassioned talks, explaining the meaning and implications of these new bills before Congress, and urging people to write to their senators and representatives to express their opposition to the pending legislation. The few who attended were interested and concerned, and there was much lively discussion. After the gathering, John and I stayed to meet the speakers. Listen, if you're interested in helping out, Vincent Bellicourt told us, you ought to come on down and set up with us tonight. A bunch of us are getting together down at the Indian Center for a planning meeting. There's lots to do, lots of needs. You might pick up on something. When John and I arrived at the Native Center, more than a dozen natives were already there, sitting in a circle. They stared at us as we came through the door, and I wondered if it was appropriate for us to walk in on them. "Hey, Boyd!" Vincent piped up, slapping the chair beside him. "Sit right over here." John and I joined the circle, but we were the only non-natives there, and we seemed to have created an awkward pause. There was much to be planned, we learned, and the needs were many. The natives expected their numbers to grow into the thousands as the march proceeded across the United States from Alcatraz Island to Washington, D.C. There would be need for supplies like shoes and bandages and even toothpaste, not to mention food and money, and there would have to be places for them to stop at the night along the way. We invited some representatives to talk at a gathering at our center so that we could help promote support for this monumentous undertaking. We gathered a group about as large as had gathered on the campus. Several representatives from both the advance team and the local Native Center came. One man introduced himself, saying that he belonged to a once proud and powerful tribe that had lost its language, even most of its culture and history, and all of its population but for 7 known remaining members. He told us that if the bills before Congress should pass and the government should take away the remaining reservations, rights, and recognition of the natives, this would become the fate of all the tribes. Another native spoke up in disagreement. "No," he said, "it'll never happen. That's what they like to think. That's what they're aiming for, but we can't even think like that. We can't buy into that vision." "I think that's what we mean," said another. "That's what this whole thing is about, to counter that image and strengthen our own vision, the vision of our people." Everyone who had gathered for the presentation and discussion wanted to support the cause, and volunteered to help collect some of the basic necessities. The solicitation project was launched, and by the time the march reached Kansas, many individuals, shops, and markets had contributed offerings of money, food, and supplies. We had even obtained the use of a large property near Lake Perry, not far from the Topeka city limits, where the marchers could camp. This was an important halfway stop for the natives because the marchers who had come all the way from the west coast were joined by the runners from the north, and the two movements merged and joined forces. Their numbers grew to over 1,000, and they remained at the Kansas campsite for over 1 week, resting, making further preparations, and gathering additional supplies. The Haudenosaunee people and other eastern tribes were organizing in their own areas to rendezvous with the longest walk, at some point farther east. We had been in constant touch with Mad Bear and, with his help, had contracted traditional leaders of the Kickapoo, Potawatomi, and other Midwestern tribes. The new and expanded configuration of leaders and medicine people needed several days of meetings for reorganizing and decision-making. John and I and others made several trips between the campsite and our center in Topeka. One evening, we talked with some of the native organizers as we sat around the fire. I told them I had contacted the local chapter of the Red Cross, as it had seemed to me that they would have on hand such things as soap and toothbrushes. I had been questioned at great length by the woman at the Red Cross office who was trying to determine the nature of the emergency. I was informed that in this circumstance the natives would not qualify for assistance. Unless there was some crisis or catastrophe, such as a flood or fire at their campsite, the Red Cross could not respond. That was simply a Red Cross requirement, she had told me, and I told her that I understood. "Well, I don't understand these protests," the woman remarked. "That's not the reason for this policy, of course. We're just set up to respond to disasters. But I don't understand why these Indians insist on hanging on to their difficulties. We have equal opportunity in this country. Why can't these people come off these reservations and join the real world? You'd think they'd want to take advantage of all the wonderful things that modern life has to offer." "And I suppose she thinks she meant well by that," one of the medicine men remarked, holding his chin and leaning over the fire. "She just doesn't know. Well, I don't understand why people insist on hanging on to their ignorance." The others nodded. "The difficulties of which she speaks have nothing to do with our native identity or our way of life. Any hardships we're experiencing are related to oppression. But it's the difficulties all people face, all people and all our relations on the face of this earth that concern us now. That's what this is all about, this historical long walk, and it's not the end of it either. And this ain't no protest neither. This thing ain't," the eldest added. "This here's a sacred ceremony we're doing in our own sacred way. We filled that pipe with our prayers in a sacred manner like we've been instructed. We put our heart and soul in there, and that pipe's been walked, on foot, every single step of the way, too. That's our prayers, and that's our prayers for everyone, not just ourselves. That ain't no protest, but that's what they've been calling it, every step along the way, and I don't appreciate that neither." One morning, we arrived at the campsite to find 2 live pigs tied to a tree. A local farmer had brought them out in his truck that morning, we learned, and offered them as donation. The natives had considered this a worthy gift and had accepted the pigs with gratitude, and it had become a topic of deliberation among the elders and the leaders. There was no way to take them along the march, and they would have to be butchered and eaten in the short time that remained before the march began again. It would have been inappropriate not to accept them, but it would be equally inappropriate not to deal with them properly. It was a significant affair, and those qualified to deal with it had been carefully selected. It had to be determined that the pigs were to be used in this way. An appropriate acknowledgement and offering needed to be made. It was essential that the pigs be slain without pain or suffering, and that they be shared by everyone, and no part of them wasted. When next we visited the site, the deed had been done. Whatever was edible had been incorporated into the food supply, and the rest put aside for some further use. The natives broke camp quickly and quietly, and set out on their eastward journey at sunrise one morning, and, though for many days hundreds of them, men, women, and children, had cooked, slept, and played on the land and held their many sweats and ceremonies, they left not one single sign that they had ever been there. Some of the young people who had been helping during their stay left with them. They had made friends among the natives and had been taken with their cause, and when they had seen that there were several Japanese Buddhist monks among them who had come all the way from San Francisco, they asked if they could be allowed to join the march. The organizers of the march had made it clear that the longest walk was for people of all colors and cultures, and that anyone and everyone was welcome to join them in support for their cause. A few weeks after they left Kansas, I and 3 coworkers drove east to rendezvous with the marchers. Bill Hale had just finished medical school when he moved in with us in our College Avenue Center and became one of our incorporating members. He decided that he and I should take his car all the way to Washington, D.C. and back. Tim and Pam Ballingham, a couple who had first come to one of our workshops, had become interested in our work, took time off from their teaching schedule in the art department at the University of Utah to join us on the trip and follow along in their little Honda Civic. We planned to meet up with the longest walk at the state prison in Marion, Indiana, and from there continue east, joining the marchers at intermittent stops all the way to Washington, D.C. Since we had embarked upon a several-week journey to Washington, D.C., and beyond with several side trips along the way, both going and coming back, our 2 cars were needed for our separate trips. Besides, we had all our luggage, so neither car was large enough for the 4 of us. Marion was a major stop for the marchers and their movement, and thus another several-day layover. Here, Leonard Peltier was incarcerated in the state prison. The circumstances of his arrest were very controversial, but it was generally believed among Native Americans, as well by several independent journalists who investigated the story, that he was a political prisoner incarcerated on contrived charges to weaken the traditional leadership. His had become a famous case among all Native Americans, as well as those concerned with Native affairs and civil rights. We arrived at the Native camp before sunrise to participate in the ceremony outside the prison. Hundreds of natives of many tribes, and the various non-natives who had joined them, were shuffling about in the dim, gray light of early morning to locate their groups, prepare their banners and posters, and receive their instructions and their place in the ceremony. The various leaders came around with papers, instructions, transportation assignments, and Leonard Peltier buttons to be pinned on shirts and jackets. It was amazing to see the degree of preparation and organization that had been established among so many tribes and groups of people, even as they had walked these hundreds of miles from the West Coast. Everyone piled into cars, trucks, and buses for the ride to the prison, and the 4 of us followed, in our 2 cars. I rode with Bill in his car, and Tim and Pam followed in theirs. As we gathered at the top of the road outside the prison, we had a chance to talk with those whom we had helped to join the longest walk in Topeka. Many of them had become so uncomfortable that they were hoping we could be going back and they could return with us. "These people are racist," one of them told us. They openly dislike non-native people. Others felt that it was not racism. After all, they had encouraged the non-natives to join them. Perhaps long frustration and renewed anger at recent events had made them openly blameful. Well, I agree with them, but they shouldn't include all of us. Why do they think I'm here supporting them? They use really strong language talking about the white man, and I'm sitting right here with them. And they never talk to us directly. They just talk to each other so that we can hear them. They do it on purpose, too. They do it to embarrass us. They all agreed that the natives wanted them to hear their criticism and wanted them to feel ashamed. They supposed the natives had their reasons, perhaps to motivate them to make changes, but it was painful to be with them, and they all wanted to leave. We convinced them that they were making a contribution, and in fact, this was an opportunity to experience what the native people had almost universally experienced over centuries. In any case, we told them, unless they could see their way to get themselves back home, they would have to stick it out for the duration. This was not an easy trek for any of the walkers, we reminded them, and the natives were at least sharing their food and their supplies, and their hospitality, such as it was. The entire group lined up 3 or 4 abreast all along the side of the road and arranged themselves to begin the march down the hill to the prison gates. Some of the leaders walked up and down the line to make sure that the people did not crowd into the road, but left room for the prison vehicles to pass back and forth. There were many police and prison guards at the top of the hill and along the shoulders on either side of the road, but they only stood quietly and watched or occasionally talked or joked with the native organizers. Then the march began to slowly move down the hill toward the prison. It was a spectacular sight. Many natives in striking regalia with vividly colored banners, flags, and posters. There were singers and drummers and people with flutes and rattles. It was an impressive display, but there was no one here to see it or hear it but the officers and the marchers themselves. Perhaps it was indeed a protest, an expression of opposition against the incarceration of Leonard Peltier and others whom the natives regarded as political prisoners. But to these traditionals, this was a ceremony, and they had come with great hardship to offer prayers and sacrifices for their cause. To the surprise and disappointment of the organizers, the march never reached the site of the outer prison walls. The marchers had obtained permission, they had thought, to proceed to the outer gate of the prison, and then for 1 or 2 of the representatives to visit Leonard Peltier inside the prison. But somehow, some officials had a change of heart, and barricades had been placed far up the road out of sight of the prison. It was for security reasons, they were told, and to ease the coming and going of prison officials. At the barricades, the march stopped and everyone crowded into a circle as best they could at the side of the road. Here, songs were sung and prayers led, and some of the medicine people conducted the personal sacrifices, the offerings of flesh, for all who volunteered to participate. This offering symbolizes our will and determination, one of them explained. Even those of us who think we have nothing to give, nothing to offer in prayer, can give the ultimate gift. We can give ourselves. We can offer our very flesh. The medicine people who were adept at carrying out this tradition carefully peeled razor-thin slices of skin from the arms of those who stepped forward to make their sacrifices. We remained for what seemed like nearly the whole day, continuing the ceremonies and waiting to see whether anyone would be allowed inside. At times, people came out of the prison and stood on the other side of the barricades to talk with the leaders. At last, 2 of the leaders were allowed to pass through the barriers and were escorted inside. Then, gradually, the group dispersed, ambling randomly up the hill to where the vehicles waited. Later that evening, the 2 who had been invited inside the prison returned to the campsite. We watched as various groups gathered around to hear the news of Leonard Peltier. They had spoken with him, we had learned, and had talked of many issues and of the longest walk. There was not much they could offer him in the way of immediate hope. One of those who had been inside walked up to us and said, All this concrete and all these walls create a false feeling of power and control. People think they can achieve control by creating something unnatural, but it's just an illusion. One day, the little blades of grass will come back and claim what's theirs, and all this concrete will crumble into dust. There's no justification for keeping anybody inside those walls in such unhealthy circumstances. I don't care who they are. The native people of these continents lived for thousands of years without these prisons. This notion belongs to a foreign culture. It's foreign to mankind. Actually, foreign to all life. You people brought this prison system over here from over there, and look what a mess it's made of everything. It's made people all the more cruel and cold and scared. To tell you the truth, I think you people have your prisons out of fear, though fear never solves anything. You people get yourselves so far away from nature you get weak and scared, afraid of one another, your very own people. Imagine. And yet, you go on doing just what it takes to make your society even worse. I'll make one prediction here. One day in the future, you're going to have more prisons than schools and hospitals put together. And then, soon after that, because of that, everything will come tumbling down, and the grass will come back. We returned to our motel that night, and the following day, the natives prepared to break camp. We drove out of town. We bought a local paper from the vending machine outside the restaurant where we had breakfast. There was a small item on the front page reporting that native militants had launched a protest outside the prison and that police had to be called to break up a riot. We considered stopping to phone the paper, but we went on our way. There was no way to know whether this report was racist, politically motivated, or simply a case of misinformation. Perhaps it was an attempt on the part of the editors to make a more engaging story of an event whose real meaning they were not prepared to understand. When the natives came to the end of the longest walk in Washington, D.C., spring had passed and it was summer. The air was hot and sticky, and it was difficult to walk among the glaring sidewalks. The District of Columbia was a domain of concrete, and everything reflected heat onto everything else. Our cars had no air conditioning, and neither, we discovered, did the humble hotel rooms that had been arranged for us through a friend. It was hard to decide whether to be in our rooms, on the street, or in the cars. Though the cherry blossoms and the beautiful weather had left, summer tourists were here in abundance. In any case, inside or out, we had to spend the time in town until the longest walk arrived and completed their initial meetings. We tried our best to enjoy our sightseeing and hoped the air would be more accommodating for the walkers at their campsite in the woods. Tim and Pam and I rode with Bill in his car to the Greenbelt Park, leaving their Honda at the hotel. It was only mid-morning and the sun had not yet reached its full potential, but as soon as we had entered the park and driven in under the shade of the trees, it was apparent that the days and nights would be at least somewhat more hospitable in this setting. Camping would be easier, especially for the little ones, and lack of warm wraps and blankets would no longer be a problem. The native camp, we supposed, should have grown quite large, and we should quite easily come upon it. One of the main roads seemed to be closed, so we turned onto a side road and drove past several groups of people preparing their picnic lunches. But when we came to a dead end, we reversed our direction. This side of the park is closed," the man in the gatehouse told us as we pulled up to where the chain was stretched across the main road. "There's a special event in there this week." This was no doubt what we were looking for, and we explained we were working with a native group on the longest walk. "You can drive right on in," he said. "Just pull up around the other side of that post there." We drove through the campsite, wondering where to stop or where to park or whom to approach. For a long while we saw no one whom we recognized. The number of natives and non-natives as well had multiplied, it seemed, with each eastward mile of the longest walk. People from many tribes had been ready and waiting to take up the march as the growing caravan passed through their territories, and representatives from several northeastern tribes had come down to rendezvous at the site. The place looked like a huge intertribal village, or in fact, an international village. Many non-natives, especially young students and activists, and East Coast members of the Buddhist organization had joined the movement and arranged themselves in the campsite. We pulled off the road at a place where several other cars were parked and got out to walk. Finally, some of the native people recognized us, and we greeted them and told them we were looking for Mad Bear's camp. We found him in his tent, asleep. "Let's wake him up," someone called to us. "We're all going down to the Capitol, down by the Washington Monument. Everyone's heading out pretty quick." "Hey, there you are. I was expecting you just about now," he mumbled groggily from inside the tent. "I knew you were arriving. I wasn't asleep. I was just dreaming. Give me a moment here and I'll be right out." We walked down the road to find the non-Indian camp, as it had been labeled by the others, to see the friends we had seen last in Marion who had indeed stuck it out and made it all the way. We passed the camp where the Japanese Buddhist monks were staying and stopped to talk with them. "They have us all separated out," they told us. "Some of them did not want it like this, but other ones, some of the leaders, they think it is better so we can talk our own way with each other whatever we want. But the white camp, they call it the white camp, it's too far away, way over there. You can't see from here. Maybe they are okay with it." Before we had a chance to find the white camp, someone came to tell us that Mad Bear was up and waiting for us. On our way back, we found Grandfather David Montague being slowly led along the road toward Mad Bear's camp. We all spoke to him and he responded cheerfully, but we did not bother to identify or introduce ourselves. At this final destination of the longest walk, there were over 3,000 natives from perhaps every tribe and many dozens of others, and there was no need for Grandfather David to try to keep track of everyone. "Well, here you all are," Mad Bear smiled, shaking our hands. "And by golly, it's good to see you. I just needed a minute there to crawl out of my cot and try to look halfway charming for you people." He was dressed in his full regalia with his buckskin vest and feathered cap. "We're heading out just now, so your timing was right on the button. These people are taking care of David, but I'm going to ride with you folks if you've got the room." All 5 of us piled into Bill's car, with 3 of us in the back and Mad Bear in the front seat. We followed the long caravan of cars, vans, and buses through the town and then followed the directions of the officers who stood on the streets around the monuments to control traffic. Hundreds walked from the parking lot to the Washington Monument. There was an additional congregation of many natives from many tribes at the monument, and the colorful exhibition of tents and teepees, banners, posters, information tables, drummers, and singers stretched across the grounds. When the entire crowd had gathered on the grounds, the group was assembled and organized for the march to Lafayette Park. The huge crowd of traditional natives made a spectacular sight as they marched through the streets of the capital in their various colorful regalia. Of all the marches, celebrations, pageants, exhibits, and social events seen in this large park across the road behind the White House, this gathering was no doubt among the most eccentric and picturesque. There were thousands of natives in this park, and they were joined by hundreds of others. The non-native contingency had grown considerably since we had seen the group. No doubt many had come from both north and south to join the campers at Greenbelt Park, but also, no doubt, many local people had come just for this event. Perhaps even some tourists and other passerby had been attracted by the crowd and the music and the banners. Nearly all tribal leaders and spokespersons, it seemed, gave talks, and there was singing and drumming, and the event was on throughout the entire day. Grandfather David Montague was among the first to speak. He spoke his lengthy opening prayer in the Hopi language. Then he paused and began in English. "Well, we have just gathered here together to see that we will respect one another from now on. We are all brothers and sisters, all of us, all over the earth, and we will always be brothers and sisters. So it's time from now on to begin to respect one another all over this land and to carry this out from now on. We have no weapons of any kind. We have come here without weapons. We have come here without any purpose to harm anyone. We only want to preserve our culture. We do not want to be dissolved. We have come here from all over, many tribes, from great distances. We all know what purpose we are here for. We are here because we want freedom. There was a loud applause from all around him, and as I had seen happen before, it appeared to me that David may have well caught a faint glimpse of the view from where he stood. Well, now is the time to share our prophecies to the world. I cannot go into detail here because my time here may be limited, and I have a lack of English. Some of you may be aware of our prophecies because Thomas Banyanka and we went all around different areas to instruct on the prophecies. We are doing this so that we will all work together. That is why we need freedom for our people not to be dissolved. We believe our culture must blossom forth so that we can work together. Not only Indian people, but many other people as well, all over the world are having problems, and we all need to stand together. We are gathered here because we believe in our sacred instructions, and we want to preserve our way of life. He went on for some time until someone stepped up beside him and said something in his ear. There were many spokespersons scheduled to speak. So, in closing, I would just like to pray for everyone, all brothers and sisters. I pray that we will not be dissolved, but that we may be able to preserve our way of life. May the fragrance of love go into every human heart and soul, so that we can live in peace and brotherhood, and respect one another as brothers and sisters, and live a good life from now on. Russell Means followed Grandfather David, and he referred to the Hopi records and prophecies as enduring over tens of thousands of years of near-perfect existence, and among the most profound revelations of mankind. I also want to thank David, he said, for asking for the support of non-native peoples, and now I would like to ask for the support of our non-native friends, because now that the longest walk is almost over, I would like to ask all our white support groups to get behind our next big national project, and that project is called The Longest Swim. Like Grandfather David, Russell Means referred again and again to the concept of respect, speaking of the bills before the House and the Senate for the abrogation of the treaties and the termination of native lands. Bills that, he claimed, were intended to do away with the native tribes, culture, religion, and bills in response to which the longest walk had been organized. He reminded his audience that since the native peoples began to be given the rights of citizenship in the 1950s, the natives had become subject to over 2,000 more laws than other citizens of this same nation, and the bills now before Congress would only add to that number. Nazi Germany's historic genocide against Jews was initiated through legislation, he pointed out, while the population believed that the government was taking care of them and looking after the best interests of all its citizens. There is only one color of mankind that has not been allowed to participate in the international community, and that's the red people of the Western Hemisphere. The white man, the black man, the yellow man, the brown man, in some form or another, have all been allowed to participate in the international community. It should be an insult to those across the street and to its programs in foreign relations that the only color of mankind that cannot walk shoulder to shoulder in the international community is right in its own backyard. The reason for this, he contended, was fear. Fear on the part of what he called the multinational corporations, the takers of the fat, and those who he alleged were guilty of raping their own mother. And the multinationals, he said, at Geneva, We tried to explain, specifically to the imperialistic countries of the world, we tried to explain to them in their own terms the meaning of respect. We told them, do not think of your natural resources any longer as income. Think of it as capital. When the multinational corporations, if they could open up their eyes to see down the road to the next generations, if they would treat the natural resources as capital instead of income, then they would make sure that in the future, the capital would remain. Because it is basic economics that once you do away with your capital, you do away with your income. And it's beside me why the multinationals and the governments cannot grasp the fact, because this is an elementary economic fact. There was an applause and a few cheers and whoops of approval from here and there around the park. They fear our collective way of life, he went on, even though they took their form of government from us. Benjamin Franklin, in 1746, stood before delegates of 10 colonies in Philadelphia, 30 years before the independence, and said, if the Iroquois up north can form a near-perfect union that appears almost indestructible, why cannot we, a more civilized people, form an even more perfect union? And so they drafted the Constitution of the United States after that of the Iroquois Confederacy. But yet they fear our culture. They fear the power of our spirituality. They want to legislate us out of existence because they fear a culture that never had zoos or penitentiaries or old age homes or orphanages. They fear a culture that respects all life and respects the earth. They call us primitive and pagan savages, and yet we can talk to a tree or a mountain or a rock, and they talk back to us. The winged things of the air, the four-leggeds, we have conversation with them to this day. It is because we know the meaning of respect. I would like all people to know that if they could understand the meaning of respect, they would not fear us, because they would understand something of the psyche and the beauty of our people. Clyde Bellicourt was introduced as a member of the Ojibwe Nation and co-founder of AIM, and founder and director of the Heart of the Earth Survival School in Minnesota. He spoke of the several schools around the United States and Canada that were established and maintained by AIM. He said that natives and non-natives had come to realize that conditions would never change for native people until they themselves took charge and direct control of their own education, and he explained how, in spite of the erroneous image of AIM as militant and extremist, AIM had amended the education and restored the self-esteem of thousands of native children who had fallen behind and who had been let down by the public school system, where native people's history and heritage was ignored or distorted. Then I saw, for the first time, Philip Deere, the well-known Muskogee Creek medicine man and spokesman. He was advisor to the leaders and members of AIM, and they called him Uncle. He spoke slowly and clearly and, at times, with a gentle smile in his voice, but there was an awesome strength in his simple directness. Today, I do not want to talk about the past. Today, I want to talk about the issues going on now. We do have problems among our many nations of Indian people. For many years I was not acquainted with other tribes, but I was well aware of my own problems. One day I walked outside of my community and met with other tribes. Talking with them, I began to realize that they have similar problems. I began to go to their reservations, and I found out that their problems are the same as mine. I knew that different tribes had different treaties, but I learned that their treatment was similar to ours. When the reservations began to shrink in small areas, the native people could not continue to live on these reservations. So, not out of choice, but because of the necessities of life, many of our Indian people had to move off the reservations. They had to move to large cities, Chicago, New York, Los Angeles. All over this country, our people began to move off the reservations and into urban areas. Because their land and their rights were being taken over by somebody else, they had to leave their homeland and move into the cities. In the cities, they felt the pains of discrimination. Our Indian people had to walk the streets of New York City, had to walk the streets of Chicago and Washington, D.C., with their heads hanging down in shame because they were Indians. But I tell you today, those days are over. Those days are over because our young people have the courage to stand up for their rights. These young people, I talk with them and I protect them. They draw attention to the native people. They have brought back pride to the native people. Over many years I heard how my grandfather and my uncles came here to Washington, D.C., year after year trying to talk with government officials and representatives. They were always denied and they were always turned away. Today, we are here, but we have walked long enough. I do not want any of my grandchildren to have to come up here and stand on this very ground and beg for human rights. I don't want our people to have to go over to Geneva and to other countries and talk about human rights over there. I think that in a nice way, we should remind President Carter to look around in his backyard. We bring to this city Indian awareness. I have noticed that in these buildings, people are so far removed from reality. The truth is hidden from these people. But we are proud to say that, as Indian people, we still understand the truth. At the conclusion of the long afternoon, everyone walked to the Washington Monument and returned to their various cars and buses for the ride back to Greenbelt Park. You people stick around if you can, Mad Bear suggested. Later on, there'll be some gatherings in the main area with some singing and social dances and whatnot. This whole affair is really organized, I commented. The way they have all these buses and the campsites assigned is pretty impressive. I noticed that when they were making the announcements, they have everything labeled. Camp A, Camp B, Camp C, and so on. But it seems like some of the non-native people think things are a little too segregated. Well, it's partly just the way everything's laid out here, he explained. You have to realize, too, that there are thousands of people camped here, and a lot of the traditionals are getting acquainted with each other for the very first time. Yet everything is peaceful and harmonious. It's about the opposite of what most people would think, right? Pretty contrary to the stereotype that's been given to us. You won't see any drinking here or any fighting, not even arguing or raised voices. You won't hear elders yelling at the little ones, and when all these thousands of people have left, no one will be able to tell that we've ever been here. But these grounds will have been cared for and will be honored and graced by the ceremonies and blessings of the traditionals. It's part of the respect these people were talking about. He was right. It was peaceful. Except for those who stayed at the monument, everyone had returned to the camps. There were people all around us, but they talked and walked softly. Even the children, who were left to run about and play as they wished, spoke quietly and no one shouted. I think some of the traditionals may have had a little bit of segregation thing in mind, Mad Bear allowed. I went down to the white camp before you people came today and had a talk with them down there. I think they're mostly okay with it. Well, for one, they're more comfortable in the long run. It's better for all the various people to have a chance just to be with each other so they can talk among themselves and carry on however they wish without feeling judged or criticized. Funny thing, some of these young whites told me they were thinking about getting married and asked if there was any medicine person around who could marry people. I told them I could do an Indian ceremony and it'd be recognized in an Indian way. So that could hold them on for now, anyways. You know, another thing we've all got to realize, this is just the beginning. Look how all these tribes and races and cultures are gathered here and living together. This is kind of a first, and it's only a sample of what's coming. Only a taste of the way it's going to be in the future. People have to be left to their own ways, or it won't happen. Every culture and religion has to be supported for what it is. The time for any one culture or race or religion to try to do away with another is over. That time has got to be over, or everyone else's time is over. That's what this whole thing is about here. You know, I said, we phoned Ron Dellum's committee and some of the Senate offices before we left and again on the road to check on the status of these so-called termination bills in both the House and the Senate. They're telling us now that these bills don't have a chance. Ron Dellum's office claims that they'll never make it to a vote on the floor. They'll never even make it out of the committee. That's what we're hearing too, Mad Bear responded, and that's what we believe. But if that's the case, our purpose is only furthered, because then maybe we can go on from here. Anyways, it's a constant struggle. We have to keep going with it. Bills like this keep coming around. When they're extreme, like these abrogation things, well, they're not so likely to go through, but it's really dangerous for us if they do pass. And some of these milder steps are even worse. These laws and rules and policies that they keep adding to apply to our indigenous people only. All these new rules and regulations keep eating away at the freedom and dignity of our people, and no one but our people seems to notice or care. So we have to keep at it, keep going forward from here, and I'm glad, for one, that we have all these different races and religions here. I hope this only grows. If all of us keep this up, can share our days and nights and ceremonies together as close as we're doing here, without trying to Christianize or convert each other, we might still have a chance to feel safe and easy again, like our people used to in the past. They're starting to serve supper down here, someone yelled. Hey Bear, ain't you gonna eat? Are you kidding? We noticed that daylight was already beginning to wane as we started for the main area. I was just thinking about what Russell Mean said back there at Lafayette Park. I reflected as we walked. He said something like only the red people have not been allowed to participate in the international community. There may be some others somewhere whose very existence and identity is denied, but I believe we're the only ones to whom that applies as an entire race. It presents a challenge, see? Because of this wish to ignore our sovereignty, it's kind of ironic. Some folks in Congress want to do away with all our treaties across the board, unilaterally, but they can't even get it to a vote. So what about these treaties? Treaties, by your government's definition, are agreements between sovereign nations. Isn't it embarrassing? They want to disregard our sovereignty, but not actually vote on it. We are not supposed to be involved, though we're parties to the treaties, because we're not supposed to represent ourselves. How can we participate in international affairs if we don't represent anything? Supper and the festivities that followed were collective affairs, but owing to the large number of people and the structure of the campsites, there were several groups spread throughout the grounds. We sat with a large group of people, mostly native elders, gathered around in a large circle of picnic tables and listened to those who offered their songs. Some people applauded after each performance, but most of the traditionals remained from clapping. One elder eventually explained to the group that it was not their custom to clap at the people who offered their prayers or dances, or even social songs, because it was more like a judgment than an endorsement. If you'll notice, those of you who aren't used to us, we just give a ho in appreciation and agreement, he explained. That way, nobody has to compare who's better than the others. Besides, somebody sings a beautiful song, why, you kind of rattle the air and disturb the feeling if you jump right in and make that clatter. After that, there were only ho's and a no clapping. We sat with Mad Bear until he was ready to retire, and walked with him back to his camp. You know, I was thinking about the UN, he told us. Now, there was an international gathering in which we were very much represented. Our culture and our religion. I'd say that in that case, we were recognized by the international community. That's right, I acknowledged. I think every race and religion was represented at that event. That was the intent. You remember, we were talking about that a while back. We were talking about that Shinto priest. Did you tell those guys about him? The one with the serpents? He looked at them for their reaction, but I had indeed told them about him. You remember? It's not just the political and corporation representatives. It's the spiritual representatives that have to get this together now. That was his point. You could call it international or intercultural or whatever, but this kind of gathering has got to be promoted. While these multinational corporations are getting together, the spiritual leaders have got to get together. Sort of like international summit conferences for spiritual leaders, Tim remarked. Right, but not international in the case of just representing their nations, and not spiritual in the sense of just representing their religions. It wouldn't be just to acknowledge each other's religion and religious rites, although that's important, so that's part of it. It would be to represent the people as a human race. Who represents the people of the villages and the city streets? Who is there to address their common condition, whatever their race or nationality? And not only that, but all our relations. Who is there to represent the rights of the four-leggeds and the finned and the winged? Who is there to speak for the trees and growing things? Who will represent the rights of the rainforests and all the precious medicines that have been helping us out? And who will there be who will speak on behalf of the mother? The people I'd like to see come and put their minds and hearts together are those who follow the spiritual paths, know the sacred ways, and can guide the people. It was late at night when we left him to return to our hotel in town. He and the others he had come with would be returning to their reservations in upstate New York and Canada, and we would be heading west. So I guess I'll crawl in here and get a little shut-eye. I wake up early, you know. Might be having a little sunrise ceremony anyways. Can you see your way up the road to your car? I'd walk with you, but then you just have to walk me back again. We assured him there was no problem and thanked him for spending so much of his sleep time with us. So come up home when you can, he called after us as we started up the road. Think about what we've been talking. We could really get into it here with all that's going on, but we should talk about it. We're ready to start working on it. We four discussed our conversation with Mad Bear on our way to the hotel that night, and we discussed it again on our way out of town the following day. I told him about the similar conversations with Mad Bear. I had already talked with John Cates about this some time ago, I explained, and we had almost considered the idea of organizing and sponsoring a gathering of what Mad Bear had called the spiritual leaders and spokespersons. John and I realized that it would be a difficult undertaking and would require much money and effort, and we could hardly pull it off by ourselves without a lot of help. I told them that John and I had not been sure whether we hoped Mad Bear would push the idea or let it go. But as Mad Bear had sat with us in the dark beside his tent in Greenbelt Park, he had come one step closer to giving us an assignment. The next step, we agreed, was up to us. He had suggested he wanted to meet and talk about it further. We decided that we should contact Mad Bear again and find out what he had in mind, or what, if anything, he had in mind for us. Our first stop on our return trip, though it was somewhat out of the way, was to visit the Himalayan Institute of Yoga Science and Philosophy near Honesdale, Pennsylvania. The Himalayan Institute had purchased a property that had once been a large Catholic monastery and had created their new main branch in this location to be accessible to New York and other major cities. I had never seen the place, though I had been invited to visit, so we had planned this stop as a part of our itinerary from the beginning of our journey. We had set aside several days to see the new biofeedback lab and research projects and to visit the staff and classes. This space of time, we decided, could allow us our opportunity to have a focused conversation with Mad Bear, and we phoned him from the Institute to set it up. Tim and Pam remained behind to attend some classes and workshops while Bill and I made a long one-day side trip in his car so that we could sit and talk with Mad Bear. I don't really have much here good to eat, Mad Bear announced as soon as we had gone through our customary native handshakes and we were inside. Or at least, not enough of anything. So we turned around and went back out and drove Mad Bear to the restaurant of his choice. Fortunately, I had explained to Bill that one simply cannot sit down and conduct a conversation with Mad Bear. You have to simply follow along and feel your way as you go, I had told him, and first you eat. There's this great place I've been to a few times, Mad Bear said, but we've never been there together. I've been wanting to show you this place. You go through the line and order your main course and potatoes, and then you get your vegetables and soup as you go. Or you can pay one price and get all you can eat from the salad bar, and it's a doozy of a salad bar. I generally go through the line and do the salad bar too, do the whole show. We were not able to talk much during supper, except about supper. I knew that all the necessary conversation always happened. Eventually, partly because Mad Bear was continually picking up my thoughts, as he put it. Our time was limited on this occasion, however. Bill was doing all the driving and was expecting to be tired, and I knew he wanted me to take charge of the conversation. But as soon as we were seated around the little kitchen table back of the house, Mad Bear began again. "It's up to you guys just how we do it, he said, as though the conversation had already been progressing and doing it had already been agreed upon. "Do what?" Bill asked. "Well, we've been planning to call a council of sorts. We're planning on holding a gathering of spiritual spokespersons from the four directions. They'll be representing all races and colors. It's not a question of what, I thought to myself. It's a question of how. But then I wondered, would Mad Bear know the how part any more than we would? "We've been working on the idea of communications and gatherings among the various traditionals," Mad Bear continued. "Thinking about a sort of joint communication on the records and prophecies and what can be shared. You heard what David said down there in Washington about sharing the prophecies. But we're thinking now about bringing in the other races and cultures. It might even help our own people come around to whatever they feel is appropriate at this time. But just how you want to pull it off, it's up to you guys. I'll help in any way I can. This thing is meant to be, so it'll happen. Just get the ball rolling and it'll all fall out in some way or another." He got up, opened the cupboard, and brought back a large package in a bowl. "The only thing to pin down here is the date, I guess," he went on as he tore open the package with his teeth. "We should pin that down so it's a reality in our minds, a set thing that we can focus on." He dumped the contents into the bowl and popped a piece into his mouth. They were pinkish, wormy-looking little cheese snacks that might have seemed a little bit less sorry-looking to me if I were not so stuffed. "Somewhere buried in here is a calendar. It's a kind of a notebook-like calendar with the moon phases on it. That's what we gotta go by. We're looking at the spring or summer because wintertime's not right for it. Wintertime's a kind of withdrawal time when everything snuggles back to the mother. It's not a reaching out time. Oh, here it is, now looky here." He opened the calendar and leafed through the pages. We decided on June. It would be warm, which would make things easier, because we supposed the gathering would require camping and cooking out. "Okay then, June. Then we just gotta find the new moon here, see, that's the native way. Native people, we go by the moon calendar, you know that. Most people do. It works best, it's the reason they do. If you want to bring into consideration any kind of conditions whatsoever, it's the moon we're influenced by. The new moon. Then all the people and the traditionals will agree to it." He drew a dark circle on his calendar. "The new moon is good. The full moon, that's crazy. We avoid that, and don't mess around too much with the full moon." Suddenly, he threw himself back in his chair and slapped his forehead. "Look at this, by golly, just look at us. Here we are chomping on these silly little things, and we just had a great big supper. We're so full we're not even hungry, and yet we can't help ourselves. They're just so doggone delicious." Bill tried to stifle a snicker, but it was audible. Neither of us had even tasted one of the silly things. "Well," Mad Bear continued, "looks like we got it pretty much pinned down. Next thing's the location. So you can set that up out your way. There's places out there that'll be good, and it's kind of right in the middle there where we can all come in from the four directions." He closed the calendar and set it aside, looking as though our meeting was adjourned. "So we'll just keep in touch," he concluded, "and you guys see what you can put together. I can help out with the contacting some of our people. I pretty much know who's among our traditionals, and they know me. Oh, by the way, that Philip Deere, you remember him. We'll get him. We'll talk to him when the time is right." He looked at me pointedly. "By golly, we might just go out there to his place and pay him a little visit. When do you think we might ought to do that? Can you manage it?" I had no answer. I had enough to think about the moment without having to plan yet another travel itinerary for Mad Bear. He reached again for his calendar and leafed through the pages. "Maybe we shouldn't try to pin that down exactly right now," I suggested. No, I was just realizing something," he said, finding the June date he had just circled and tapping it with his pen. You know, by that time, I should be already moved, though I doubt I'll have my new place up yet. I told you I'm moving, right? That's right, you mentioned it. I had forgotten about that. I got a spot up there on High Mountain Road picked out. That ought to be pretty settled any day now. I'm selling this place and getting that property up there, but there's no building on it yet. I gotta put that up myself. Meantime, I got me a good-sized trailer lined up, a big 2-bedroom job with a kitchen and everything. Maybe next time you get out this way, we'll be up there in that trailer. I hope that was okay for you, I told Bill when we were on the road heading back to Honesdale. It was a pretty brief meeting for such a long drive, and there's always a lot of extraneous talk and stuff. Yeah, but look at the result, Bill said. We did get the ball rolling, and I guess that's what we wanted. But it's a pretty big ball. I hope we didn't bite off more than we can chew. Speaking of overeating, we committed to a certain event on a certain date, so we're into it now. Now all we have to do is come up with the place and the people and the money and whatever else will dawn on us once we realize what we've done. John and others at the center wanted to hear all that the four of us could relate about the weeks of the longest walk and about the events in Washington. And in our rap session gathering, we shared the details. We learned it was a pretty trying experience for most of them, I told them, but I think that, all things considered, it was one they won't regret or ever forget. We talked about the AIM leaders and the elders and some of their speeches and about Greenbelt Park, where thousands of people were camped together and held their meetings and ceremonies. That's one thing I wish everyone could have seen, I said. I wish everyone could have experienced the atmosphere among all those natives gathered from all different tribes, the way they got along together and the way they talked around the land. Just think, thousands of native people in one campsite, and most of the time, except when they were singing and dancing, you could have heard a pine needle drop. And I'll bet if we go back there today, we'd never be able to tell that they were even there. Just like when they left this campsite out there at Lake Perry. We thought about mentioning the Cross-Cultural Spiritual Summit Conference, as we had come to call it, but we decided to keep it to ourselves until the plan had become more certain. We have plenty of time, John said in our evening meeting, but we'll need it. I think we have to talk with Mad Bear more. If he's got something specific in mind, and I think he does, I want to hear it from him. I mean, where is this thing supposed to happen, and with whom? Are we talking about a few people or a few dozen? Are we talking about a day or a week or what? Why don't you get back to him? We could meet on the phone for some of it. We don't always have to meet in person. But I think sometime soon, he should come out here. And there are things that we have to get started soon. Some of these people we're thinking of inviting. They have to set up their schedules way ahead, you know? I agreed. Mad Bear would be coming out in the spring to speak at the Prairie View Mental Health Center in southern Kansas with Jack Schwartz and me. Arrangements for that event were already underway. That could be a chance, I told him, for all of us to meet with him at our center. In the meantime, we could speak with him on the phone. And we would soon need to make our lists and send out invitations. You know, though, a lot of this is going to be up to us, I said, and I want it to be because I know that we're the ones who are going to locate the site and raise all the money. We'll have to communicate with most of the people ourselves. Anyways, I will call him soon and go over some of the first steps with him. That evening, Mad Bear phoned. I was just planning to call you, I said. So now I'm supposed to say I picked up your thoughts again. Anyways, I'm calling you now because I just talked with Philip Deere. I told you we'd be going out there. He wants us to visit him. Well, I figured it might be good, so he agreed. I can fly into Oklahoma and you guys could drive out. It's not too far for you. Just a pretty straight shot down south. We can rendezvous there at the airport and drive out to the reservation. I've never been to his place, you know, but we kind of connected there in Washington. Within only a few days after our return home, the four of us were back on the road again in our same 2-car caravan headed for Oklahoma. And within only a week after the first time we saw Philip Deere, we were arriving at his home. We spent a whole day sitting on an old bench and some folding chairs in the yard beside his house. We listened mostly as he and Mad Bear talked. For a long time, we listened with Philip's son so that Philip and Mad Bear could have a private conversation. But Philip also spoke to us. He told us about how the bureaucrats in the nearby town had attempted to connect these reservation homes to the town's water system, and how he had prevented it. It is another way of terminating our reservation status, he explained, and bringing the traditionals and their land under local jurisdiction. We went through the same thing up north, remember? Mad Bear said, giving me a poke. Our people out here. We have our wells and we raise and gather our food and stay pretty close to the land, so we don't look too modern in some people's eyes, Philip explained. Maybe that's what they're so concerned about, or maybe they'd like to get a hold of the rest of this land, what's little left. But our people out here, we're pretty educated and learned, and we'd like to hang on to that. Some of these modern school kids don't even know where their milk and eggs come from. Our kids know where their milk and eggs come from, where their vegetables come from, and just how that happens. We can understand pretty well how this life works and how to get along with it. I've been through school and our kids go to school. Some things you can get okay from books, we know that. But some things you can't just sit around and read about and call it done. Some things you gotta see for yourself and get to know directly, not secondhand. That brief rendezvous and meeting did not provide much chance for us to confer with Mad Bear about our upcoming project. But our meeting with Philip Deere did result in our first confirmation of the traditional Native American delegation. That is the end of Chapter 13. Nyawa for listening, my friends. Take care.